To the curious, the seekers, and to the experts, welcome. You're listening to Poli-Psych podcast. Several weeks ago, we noted that there seems to be a high degree of trauma that's being experienced by many Americans in the wake of the election of Donald Trump as president. We have been continuing to consider that and decided that we would highlight the Kubler-Ross model of the stages of grief known as denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. With me to discuss that topic are Ken, our MBTI specialist. Hello, Ken.
Hello, Cindy.
And Don, our Enneagram specialist / expert. Hello, Don.
Hello, Cindy and Ken.
Don.
And to introduce the subject a little more cavalierly, if you'll forgive that, we realize that there are people who are genuinely hurting, but we wanted to share a clip that will very quickly and succinctly show us the 5 stages of grief.
I'm quitting my practice. I'm retiring.
As you both know, I don't have much of a sense of humor, so sometimes it's hard for me to tell.
Mr. Monkey's not joking.
This isn't happening, and this can't be happening.
Adrian, I promise you I'll get you another doctor. I'll call you next week.
Okay, so it's not true. You're not retiring. I mean, you can't because he can't retire. Because
this is step 1 in the grieving process. Denial. Denial, yeah.
Damn you, Charles! Damn you to hell! I hate you. I hate you! You are dead to me.
That's not denial.
No, step 2, that's anger.
Okay, we're all adults here. We can work this out. I can hire you full time. I put you on the payroll.
This is step 3, it's bargaining. It usually doesn't go around this quickly.
Why me? Why is it always me? Everybody's always leaving me.
Depression.
This can't go on. It's just too much. Okay, you're right. It's not the end of the world. I'm just gonna have to find another doctor. I owe you so much. Thanks to you. I think I can get past this. Thanks, Doc.
And finally, acceptance.
Thank God that's over.
He can't retire. The man can't quit because he's not a quitter.
Wait, what's going on?
I don't know. It's like he's starting all over again, like he's in a loop.
I hate you for this, Kroger! You are dead to me, you understand me?
I thought that was pretty brilliant. I love that.
Very good.
So that's our 5 stages of grief in a easily digestible form.
And as is often the case with comedy, it makes a point that I think it actually bears pointing out that if processing doesn't occur, then you do go into a loop. So it is necessary for genuine processing to occur in these 5 different stages. And Monk has just been on the surface, hasn't really penetrated the issue, hasn't really fully released his anger, so it has to come around again, all of that kind of thing.
Well, and
Now,
it seems... I'm sorry.
For the benefit of our listeners, what are the stages of grief, Cindy?
The stages of grief are number 1, denial, and number 2, anger, number 3, bargaining, number 4, depression, and number 5, acceptance. And one thing that I find interesting about this Monk clip is the fact that he is cycling through. And I kind of, in considering this, watching videos of people's reactions to various appearances by the president and so on, I almost do feel that that people who really dislike President Trump are in kind of a cycle between denial, anger, and bargaining. I'm not sure they've even made it to depression, but it seems like they're cycling through, especially as the impeachment push continues to come up, and the talk of the 25th Amendment being used to remove President Trump from office. It just almost seems like there's a cycle here that is repeating.
One of the things that I noticed, I do think that's true, but one of the things that I noticed is that some people seem to emphasize one aspect of the cycle more than the others. And I believe that Enneagram theory helps explain that, because there are some of these keywords, such as denial, for instance, are very strongly associated with Enneagram types. And I can actually see a movement around the Enneagram as we go through these 5 stages. If you notice that type 8 there up near the top, that is denial. And then 9 wing 1 or 1 is righteous indignation or anger, is very strongly associated with that type. And then the bargaining, boy, that's the deal maker, that's the wheeler dealer, that's number 3 right there. And then the more withdrawn types, the 4 and the 5, that's where the depression comes in. But that's also where the genuine processing comes in, where you finally go deep enough to deal with stuff at the core. And then the 6, the trooper, he's ready to join the team again, and that's acceptance. So I definitely see that as relates very well to the Enneagram model.
Yeah, we've got the analog in MBTI is a little more abstract, but it relates more to the perceiving functions, which are sensing and intuition, and the judging functions, which are redefined as feeling and thinking. And the judging function is probably at least in my conception of the MBTI, is the one responsible most for anxiety and for deciding that something is awful. It's a method of sorting experience into either logical form in the thinker's scenario, which would be more like strategy and things. The plan didn't go right. What do I do about it? And then the feeler, at least values oriented, will experience awfulizing in regards to values that aren't being fulfilled, or deciding that a certain condition is, becoming negatively attached with that condition, with that frame, and perhaps negatively attached to a personality. Like you find that a lot in politics when they reduce political equation to popularity. It's very similar to how people relate to music. So with that mechanism, that's the oscillation that I can see looking through the steps.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thanks. And I do. One of the things I also wanted to point out there is that one of the things that seemed to me is that we do tend to emphasize that's just closest to us. Like if we're one of the more withdrawn types, we'll spend more time in depression. If we're one of the more extroverted, anger-oriented types, we'll spend more time in anger and denial. So there's not a smooth, even flow. It is a process, but it doesn't necessarily affect each of us equally. But we are definitely noticing this in our friends who are on the left side of the political spectrum. They never expected, I don't think, the Trump's staying power to be what it is. It just has been beyond all of their expectations.
Yeah, and I'd say that the feeler community is split fairly evenly. There's no prediction that the MBTI feeler will be liberal or conservative or even moderate. It just depends on the attachments, which are manifold. The attachment in this theory with the thinker is the attachment to logic. So if events are illogical, you'll have the same anger, the same emotional reaction. It's just that one leads the other. So in the thinker, the logical functioning leads the feeling. It's still there. And then the flip side of that is that the values orientation will open the door to logic being applied. So I think President Trump could talk all day long about whatever he wants to, and they aren't listening to him because he's not crossing over that threshold of likability with a certain portion of the population. The consultants won't usually work with Trump in Washington. I think not that he would listen either. So he's sort of on his own. He's got his own special chemistry with his followers. And I think when he's being logical and somewhat soft-spoken, he's very appealing. And the problem is that people are not getting that through their sources of media, or they've already turned it off. At that point, the door is not open to perception.
Exactly. And I think Trump, of course, is used to dealing with the world and with his own somewhat unique style. I won't say he's completely unique because a lot of entrepreneurs kind of follow this pattern, but he makes his own way in the world, and he doesn't rely on people to help mold public opinion. He does it his own way, and the whole orientation of people towards him is activated by that style. So, in other words, I believe he knows he could be more appealing if he just toned it down, if he just recognized that the media would like him more if he behaved in a certain way. But he realizes that would basically create a dependency on them that he doesn't want to create. So he's no longer in charge and the captain of the ship if he modifies his behavior to please certain groups of people.
Yeah, well, his secondary function is introverted thinking, and I think it's underrated. You don't see it. It's like the introverted feeler. You're not going to see the feeling, and I think depression is more common in the introverted feeler because it's not openly expressed, and the person suffering from depression can develop a substantial contact with that experience that's just not focused outward and expressed in the same way. But my take on that is it's a great point, is that he doesn't want to violate the rules of logic. Once he's, as a thinker, decided on a logical frame, he would not feel comfortable violating logic, just like a feeler would not feel comfortable violating either their deeply internally held values, as in the introverted feeler, or the external harmony aspect in the extroverted feeler, which is much more common. The extroverted feeler is probably the dominant play in political influencing. It is possible to sway. Values do change over time. Likability can change if it hasn't been polluted by other forces, in either whether in media or gossip or whatever. So I'd say, getting back to the stages, though, the denial stage is a perceptual, really it's a shock situation. You're locked in with either sense data or intuition. You realize something about a situation that you're perceiving. You don't have as much control over it. And the person locked in that shock initially will not be able to form or sort the experience quite yet. And this is why they do describe it as clinging to a false or preferable reality. Again, exchanging, since they can't affect it with a sorting function, they'll go back and attempt to create an alternative perceptual frame, or actually perceive reality differently in the extreme cases, and just fantasize that something is not happening. And then the second stage, anger, that becomes, again, we start the oscillation process. That's a judging function. The anger arrives when the person decides either this is not happening, it's not in comportment with my own values, or it's an illogical situation. We have that Spock. I think we had prepared that a few times, a few weeks back, to look at the reaction of the thinker the political situations at least. And I do notice this in people around me. I'm somewhat aware of their functions, and we talk about it, the close friends and so on. I've usually conned them into taking the MBTI at one point or another for fun. And they tend to chill a little better with events. They usually get right to work trying to think about how they're going to strategize to win the next time or whatever it is. But I've noticed that when the feelings are hurt, that's a very traumatic experience, and it does stir up anger. And not that the thinker doesn't get angry. Thinkers get angry when logic is violated. So the same experience, but that's not the case as much this time. Mostly, I think, because of the cultural stress of that in America, at least, politics is based on likability.
Well, one of the things that I want to point out is that each of these 5 stages is a coping mechanism. And the reason that they go by that name is because they work. They do something that helps a person maintain their psychological health. The key word being maintained. It doesn't necessarily enable you to progress. You've got to get out of that mode, but at least it gives you a sense of stability, and more than a sense, it maintains psychological stability. So on a short-term basis, all of these stages of grief are helpful to different people to different degrees, and they've been put together by Kubler-Ross, obviously, as a whole cycle, a whole pattern, but each of these is a function in itself that enables the individual to maintain some level of social stability. So I'm thankful that we have these. The point is that we need to, if we want to grow spiritually, psychologically, we want to recognize that we're using them so that we can catch ourselves and then rise above them. So the point is, each of them, if you're not aware of the whole cycle, they become rigid and you box yourself in. If you become aware of them, then you use them and you have options. So that's the key thing to pretty much everything that we're presenting here is we want to give people options. We want to help them see what's going on in themselves and in their friends so that they can move on and get out of that loop that Monk was caught in, hilariously.
No, I'm going to introduce a somewhat larger theme. We tend to look at this as all Donald Trump's fault, and that's kind of the frame itself. But I'm going to step back and take a look at it in a different way, and almost in the decades-long progression of history, we had the 50s, where I think at that point we had the Eisenhower years, and the Republican administration was in power and just kind of complacent, and there were some problems that started to emerge. We had racial discrimination, and the Vietnam War started to heat up, and the poverty situation in the South was getting worse. So the Republicans had sort of ossified into this. We also had the McCarthy era during that time, and at that point, the modern liberal movement began to offer solutions along the lines of the anti-war movement, and the liberal establishment at that time was very enlightened about racial issues, and we could debate on the poverty thing. That was solved. It just was solved using potentially dysfunctional methods and putting our budget deficit into the mega debt zone. So we have this sort of false prosperity now. Personally, there are differences of opinion on this, but I think race relations are pretty good. There's still some rough edges in certain areas, but for the most part, there's no real barrier at this point, at least in the urban areas, to advancement. And the war itself, the Vietnam War is gone. We've created a few new ones, but they seem to be low-level conflicts rather than all-out war. And so the point is that the liberal political equation has changed. And I believe that in the intervening Clinton in Obama years especially, became the complacent. They put on the complacent hat that the Republicans had in the 50s. And they've kind of lost their footing as far as, okay, what do we have to fight against at this point? So we have some new issues that are thrown out there that are the sexual politics is used quite a bit, but that's kind of socially corrosive in some ways. There's some primordial things going on when you start trying to engineer human sexuality, and it's not going quite the way they thought it might have. There's an equal and opposite counter reaction to that going on. The liberal establishment has attempted to promote racism, actually sort of building a straw man and trying to bring that as a center of social gravity for their movement. That hasn't gone well. So what we have to draw back is that there was something going on that doesn't have anything to do with Donald Trump, in my opinion. And this really is the adjustment that's going on in culture. Denial, anger, and bargaining. The bargaining being the more constructive of the at least the early stages of grief. And that might start to happen. I agree with Cindy. I think we're still in the really early stages, and there's an oscillation that even Kubler-Ross pointed to, that so it's not steps. She actually retracted that theory later in life. I'm not up on how she amended it, but it was probably more of a dynamic process where you're moving through almost like a dot plot and not in any organized fashion. So again, just to see what you think, Don or Cindy, about the broader cycle, because we'll face it, anybody, any supporter of Donald Trump or whoever you're supporting, that too will pass. So in the continual evolution, I think we'll see this sort of ossification and then counter reaction depending on what's going on in the world at any given time.
I agree. I see it very similarly to what the way that you outlined over the decades since the 1950s, and where the modern liberalism came into power and it's become complacent. I generally, I'll agree with you, buy into that script. The one thing I will also note is that even on a larger scale is that all political structures tend towards rigidity once they form. I think you're actually saying that. It's just I'm saying it specifically that once a power structure forms, its values and its whole reason for existence become locked in to the point where the structure needs to create the enemy in order to justify itself. So it looks to me like that's what the left has been doing. And now many people are wondering if that even makes sense today.
I feel like also we're, to some extent, Americans are not being permitted to move through the stages in whatever order, because the denial and anger are continually reinforced by much of the media, constantly saying, well, Donald Trump's, we're going to get rid of him by this means, we're going to get rid of him by that means, so that people, rather than finding a peace with reality, with the way things are continually looking for new reasons to remain in denial, and when that fails, clinging to anger.
Yeah, that exact point occurred to me earlier. I'm really glad that you made it. And going back to the Monk clip, the interesting thing that Monk says in the very beginning, after what's his name, Kohler, whatever his psychiatrist's name is, he tells him he can't be seeing him anymore, and then Mike's immediate reaction is completely illogical. He says, "Oh, I'm glad you were just kidding. You know, I'm glad that I have a humor failure here, and you were giving me a joke." He just completely misinterprets it, and that's what we see the media doing. They're not allowing the process to continue because they're actually putting another twist on it that to put it bluntly, keeps the lie alive. It keeps the false premise above the surface. And as I mentioned earlier, we eventually want to get to some introspection there where we first bargain, and then it's called depression, but what you're really doing is going inside, you're internalizing this thing, and once you come out the other side, things are resolved. And if people are not allowed to go there, they never get there. If their whole reality is media based, and hearkening back to a show we did earlier that had limited exposure, is a network where the Howard Beale character says, you people are the real thing. The tube is an illusion. And so many people are living in that illusionary world. They're not, and the illusionary world is not allowing them to penetrate into those deeper layers. So people get stuck.
Well, the bargaining process does seem to be healthy, but it can break down. And I've noticed this in working with the MBTI for a number of years, is that when people's number one function is frustrated or dysfunctional, they'll fall back on all of a sudden the second or third. Many times the third function will just kind of come out of nowhere, because it's almost like you're out of ammo. And this, I think I've seen this happen on with the political situations, when a feeler's values are so they just have to check out of the feeling. They just turn that part of them off. And then what do we have left? We have the thinking function, but it's many times it'll be the third one down the stack. And it not because people can't think, but it's a muscle they haven't used in a while. And so you'll get this sort of thinkers are usually a little bit more strategic, and they tend to like to win, and binary thinking and all that. So you'll tend to see a tertiary thinker making a lot of mistakes in the strategizing process, because it's just not their go-to. They don't enjoy using that function in normal life when everything's going great and the values are in alignment and there's social harmony. And I think we've seen that breakdown. And you'll see the same thing with people on the right. When the thinking function, when people are acting illogical, I think we had there was a situation with Scott Adams, and he's been working on the Charlottesville hoax for a long time, and someone came back and just sort of repeated the same thing, and he gave Jesus a new middle name in a tweet. And that, I didn't point this out, but it's sort of an example of what I'm talking about. I would classify him as a thinker, but if somebody's just being repeatedly illogical, all of a sudden he turns off the thinking. That's not a very smart move to use profanity on Twitter these days. And his feeling, his anger came out. And anger is definitely a values-oriented attachment. And it was kind of infantile. He had kind of an eruption of anger that's unusual for him. He normally is very even-tempered.
In the interest of the pursuit of being even-tempered, we thank Mr. Monk for sharing his experience via film. To the curious, the seekers, and also to the experts, we thank you for joining us for this episode of Poli-Psych Podcast. Please click like if you have indeed liked our work today. We ask you to share our link with your friends. We invite you to subscribe so that you never miss an episode of Poli-Psych Podcast. Our episodes are produced approximately once per week. And until next week, take care.